ice disruption, so it's worth keeping an eye on that throughout the day. Temperatures just a touch down compared to Saturday for the southeastern England due to the increased amounts of cloud, but probably a little warmer for parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland. Into Monday, we'll see this cold front spreading its way in, and behind that, it will feed in some fresher air, so removing that warm and humid conditions. But on the cold front itself, quite an unsettled day. Again, some heavy showers and rain. Could be some thunderstorms in there as well. Eastern areas holding off a touch until later on in the day, but the new working week does look to stay relatively unsettled for many of us, with further showers and rain. Bye-bye.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Monday to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Hi, I'm Dan Wootton. You can watch me live on GB News Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. And did you know that you can also watch and listen live on our website, gbnews.com. You'll always be up to date on the latest breaking news, as well as enjoying the best stories, opinions and shows. You can even join the debate under our live player as you're watching. So head straight to gbnews.com on TV, radio and online. GB News, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Good evening, fellow travellers. I am Neil Oliver, and this is live on GB News TV and on radio. As a 19-year-old girl reportedly dies in hospital after being denied the choice of undergoing experimental treatment, what on earth happened to personal sovereignty in the face of the state? Questions over the drug Midazolam, used as part of what is called end-of-life care. Many are questioning why their elderly loved ones were administered the drug, particularly during the pandemic. I'm joined by Andrew Bridgen, MP for Reclaim UK, and also by Emma, who believes her dad died as a result of Midazolam. I'll also be speaking to General Practitioner Dr. Malcolm Kendrick in the search for answers. And finally, we'll be talking about an 8,500-year-old stilted village dated to many, many millennia before the birth of Christ that's been discovered submerged in a lake near Greece with some remarkable engineering and interesting defence mechanisms. I'll be joined by a professor researching the lost town to learn more about the extraordinary find. All of that and more coming up, but first an update on the latest news from Ray Addison.
Thanks, Neil. Our latest stories this hour. The actor and comedian Russell Brand has been accused of rape, sexual assaults and emotional abuse. That's according to a report in The Times. Now, he's denied the allegations and is due to perform in London this evening. Our national reporter Theo Shikomba has been outside Wembley Park Theatre.
Comedian and actor Russell Brand took to his Twitter or X profile and YouTube, where he has millions of subscribers, highlighting some letters he's received from the mainstream media. GB News now understands that this was from the Channel 4 programme Dispatches and the Sunday Times, which they highlight a number of allegations from 4 women, which allegedly took place between 2006 and 2013, when he was a presenter on Radio 2 and an actor in Hollywood films. Now, he's gone on to say he strenuously denies these allegations and refutes them, but he is due to perform at this theatre in North London this evening, where some are still expecting him to attend.
In other news, American XL bully dogs will not be culled. Now, that's despite the Prime Minister's promise to ban the breed by the end of the year. The UK's top vet says an amnesty will be in place for those who already own the animals if they follow certain rules. A similar approach was taken in the 1990s when pit bulls were banned. Conservative MP Kit Malthouse told us owners need tougher consequences.
Absolutely have to deal with irresponsible owners. And, you know, a decade ago or so more, we campaigned also for greater consequences for owners. The sentencing was raised. I mean, I think you can get up to 14 years if your dog kills somebody, right? So that is absolutely part of the mix. But we have to recognize there are certain types of dog that are more capable than others of inflicting harm and damage.
Meanwhile, a man who was arrested in connection with a fatal dog attack in Staffordshire has been released on conditional bail. Ian Price, who was 52, died after he was attacked by 2 dogs believed to be XL bullies. Police say a 30-year-old man from the Lichfield area has been interviewed and has been released pending further inquiries. A second teenage boy has been arrested on suspicion of murder after 14-year-old Nathaniel Shani was fatally stabbed in Manchester. 2 boys, aged 13 and 14, are now in custody. Police were called to the incident last night on Tavistock Square. Greater Manchester Police have imposed a Section 60 order, which gives them greater stop and search powers until this evening. Now, police searching for a missing ex-British soldier have been informed by Ukrainian authorities that they found a body. 36-year-old Daniel Burke from South Manchester was reported missing on the 16th of August. His family had not heard from him and believed that he'd travelled to Ukraine. Greater Manchester Police is working to carry out a formal identification and bring his remains back to the UK. Thefts and verbal abuse in shops have increased by 25% over the last 12 months. The Federation of Independent Retailers say the rising cost of living is causing an increase in the shoplifting of everyday products such as tinned food. The group also says social media trends are encouraging young people to post videos of themselves stealing on sites such as TikTok. It comes after the John Lewis boss described rising rates of shoplifting as an epidemic. Well, a man has been arrested in the Royal Mews area next to Buckingham Palace. Scotland Yard saying that officers responded after a person climbed the wall earlier this morning. A 25-year-old was detained outside of the stables. He's been arrested on suspicion of trespassing on a protected site and taken into custody. Police say at no point did the man enter Buckingham Palace. This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now let's get straight back to Neil.
She is dead. The girl who wanted to live in defiance of a rare genetic condition. The girl who fought, in the end, to live in defiance of NHS doctors and a judge who declared and ruled that she should just lie down and die, is gone now. We were not and are not allowed to know her name. Her grieving family are still barred by the court that condemned their daughter to death from naming her in public. We have been allowed to know her only as ST, which is coincidentally shorthand for saint. Saints are remembered long after they are gone. This is where we are now. A sovereign individual says she wants to live, asks the state to help her stay alive, makes clear her intention to exercise her God-given free will to seek potentially life-saving treatment elsewhere. 2 psychiatrists listened to the 19-year-old while she lived and concluded that she was of sound mind and able to make her own decisions regarding her treatment. Other sovereign individuals stood ready to help the girl to finance her proposed trip to Canada for experimental treatment. Despite all that, in sullen defiance of all that, NHS doctors decided her unwillingness to accept her death was inevitable, made her delusional. Everyone's death is inevitable. Are we to accept that each one of us is delusional if we seek to fight death every inch of the way? A judge agreed ST was deluded and the die was cast. Now she is dead, as prescribed by the state. This is where we are now, confronted at every turn by an overmighty, overweening state that has assumed the ultimate power over sovereign individuals. Somewhere along the line, at some point, most of us overlooked, myself included, sovereign Britain was subverted or otherwise replaced by corporate Britain, in which a board of corporate types assumes the authority to make all decisions on our behalf. I say this is unlawful in every way that matters. It's also monstrous and just plain wrong. Too few people know, remember, far less celebrate what it is to be sovereign. We're not taught any of this at school, which is hardly surprising given the recent context. But the truth is that we are born sovereign, and to be sovereign is to have absolute authority over our own bodies. We are subject to the common law of the land, which we break only when we harm others, damage their property, steal what is not ours, or behave fraudulently in our dealings with others. Every other attempt by the state to interfere with our freedom to go about our lives unmolested is the stuff of statute, which is the legislation, acts and bills drawn up and passed by Parliament. Legislation has power over us only if we consent to it. Rules and regulations defined by statute are said in dictionaries of law to acquire the force of law only when we grant our consent. A fact of being sovereign is that if we withhold or withdraw our consent, that is the end of the matter. And deep down where the state and all its little wizards would prefer we did not look, the state knows this too. Over and over again, it has been necessary to pull the state up by the scruff of its scrawny neck and remind it of the limits of its power, and to have it acknowledge instead the supreme power of the sovereign individual. Magna Carta was the consequence of one of those times when an overmighty king had to be reminded that, like everyone else, he was subject to the law of the land. King John wriggled on that hook, but it was swallowed deep. Parliament would prefer Magna Carta did not exist, but it does exist and always will, and it burns the state like holy water thrown in a demon's face. If the state could destroy Magna Carta, unmake it, then it surely would. The state seeks to dismiss it, to paper over it, to distract us and have us look the other way, to persuade us the great charter's power is gone long ago like that of a battery run flat. But deep down, the state knows the law of the land still thrums with power over them. The fact, the inconvenient truth, is that the law of the land is older than Parliament. Magna Carta, which only restated and reaffirmed the ancient common law, was sealed before Parliament even existed, and so is literally beyond Parliament's remit. The unwritten constitution for which Magna Carta speaks is likewise out of Parliament's reach. The law of the land just is. We all know without having to be told that it's wrong to kill, to do harm, to steal, to lie. Parliament, government, the state are no more and no less than creations of human beings. That which is created by human beings stands beneath human beings, is subordinate to human beings, serves and does not rule human beings. Remember that too when talk turns to artificial intelligence. Nefarious types in the state know the inalienable rights of people are constant as the North Star. Many of the state's minions may have chosen to forget as much. Plenty of Parliament's wizards are, like so many other people, genuinely unaware of the truth of the law. Lack of knowing is of no significance. The truth is the truth, whether it's known or not. Magna Carta was the restating of truth, restating of the common law that by the time of the sealing of that charter was old beyond the reach of memory. The Nuremberg Code, born in the dark shadow of World War II and all its attendant horrors, was another time when some people had to be reminded of that which is true, which is that the individual, every individual, is sovereign, having absolute authority over his or her flesh and blood, and that nothing at all might be done to a sovereign individual against their will without their consent. The code is primarily for the attention of physicians, and point number 1 states, quote, "The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion." The Nuremberg Code is not binding in a legal sense, but which decent human being would dispute the thinking and intent at the heart of its matter? How much of the Nuremberg Code was ignored during the COVID debacle? How much is still being ignored while I speak these words? There is much debate over whether or not the state uses what are called legal fictions to gull us into submitting to its legislation. There are those who argue that our birth certificates and the registering of our births are part of a legal process, legal and not lawful, by which a corporation is created in each of our names as it appears on our birth certificate, and then by the process of the registering of the birth, that corporation is handed off to the state to do with as it pleases. That legal fiction has been described as being like an overcoat tailored by the state and offered to each of us for wearing. If we don the coat, the thinking goes, we unwittingly accept the rules of the game the state is playing. Be that as it may, entertain the speculation about legal fictions and straw men, or don't. But the fact remains that the power of the state, a creation of man, over any of us is only that which any of us consents to give. And yet the 19-year-old girl ST is dead now, without her consent, despite her spoken determination to fight for life. This is where we are now, and this is why I ask whether it's time for the call for change that is described by some as revolution. Last week I put a couple of lines on social media wondering if anyone else was thinking about revolution. Last time I checked, each of the messages had been viewed over 1 million times. I've been contacted by people from all over the West saying their thoughts chime with mine. I hear especially from Americans looking on in desperation while their country floods from the south with millions of newcomers of unknown provenance and intent. I live in a world of unanswered questions. I want to know the truth of the products pushed as vaccines. I want to know how many people were killed or hurt by those products. I want to know why hundreds more people are dying every day in this country than might have been estimated based on previous years. That's the equivalent of an unexplained passenger plane crash every day. Why are those people dying? I want to know what happened in the care homes into which vulnerable elderly people were herded from their hospital beds. So many died, many alone and in circumstances of abject misery. I want to know exactly how those elders died. I know that many of their loved ones want to know those details too. Yet again, we have plainly reached a point when the state must be reminded who's in charge, which is to say, we are in charge, the sovereign individuals of this land. This is where we are now in the West. The state is making no secret of the further powers it would award itself, fantasising about kicking down our doors and stamping on our lives. But we are sovereign people in sovereign nations, watching the day-by-day reality of a corporate takeover of our very existence. Authority over our lives, our way of life, unlawfully assumed by corporations. Corporation, there's another word worth paying attention to. It means to make or fashion into a body, a whole composed of united parts. If a corporation isn't a Frankenstein's monster, that unhappiest of creations and capable of inflicting terrible harm upon those it has come to despise, then I don't know what is. Here's the thing, I have no interest in pitchforks and flaming torches. The killing of people and the destruction of property and infrastructure are the activities of government and the state, and I want no part of that. What I do want is to talk about the need and desire for change felt by millions, many millions. I say every politician who pushed lockdowns, mandates and experimental medical procedures, not to mention the net zero suicide note, might usefully be walked out of the Palace of Westminster and sent home. We're past the time when reform was possible. It's time now for something new, something clean. Is it just me, or is there something in the wind? That's just me, of course. You can disagree. Keep your tweets and emails coming through the show. You can email gbviews@gbnews.uk and you can tweet me at gbnews and I'll try and get to comments later in the show. I'm joined now by broadcaster and lawyer Andrew Eborn. What do you make of it all, Andrew?
Well, it's certainly not just you, Neil, as your call to arms, if you like, for let's start a revolution was clearly evident. Fundamental human right is the right to choose, isn't it? The right to life and what happens with that life. And it's always very difficult with the medical profession, where we've become a nation of experts, haven't we? Where all of a sudden we're all virologists and we work on that sort of basis. We're all constitutionalists and so on and so forth. The reality is this: we're drowning in a sea of disinformation. And the more, it's a very diseased information age that we're living in. And we're right to question it. And the more that people try to shut down those questions, the more that it festers suspicion.
What do you think of my fundamental contention, and I'm not alone in saying it, that the institutions upon which we have depended seem to me so corrupted, so captured by ideology, that they cannot be cleaned out and reformed, and that we have, however difficult, no option but to start again?
Yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it? I've spoken beforehand about this, that basically trust comes in on foot and leaves on horseback. And the more you see these institutions basically abusing that trust, the less trust that there is. So we're very suspicious, and we have a vacuum of information. Our questions are not being answered. And as a result of it, conspiracy theories are rife. What we need to do is sit down with the experts, and there are different experts all the time, and basically try to get to the basic sort of fundamental answers.
I fundamentally question when you evoke the thought of conspiracy theories, because it's so pejorative. I fundamentally believe that it is simply people asking legitimate questions, often based on legitimate research. Yeah. And because it runs counter to an official narrative, it's dismissed as conspiracy theory. I mean, you could raise the spectre of JFK's assassination, which for the longest time was the original conspiracy theory, that what had happened there was other than the lone shooter. And yet, broadly speaking, that is in the public domain.
You're
that it
so
wasn't
right.
the lone shooter. Yeah. And so conspiracy theory is a is a completely devalued notion.
And deliberately so, isn't it? You're turning around, if people want to dismiss an argument, what they do is they rubbish it with words. And you're absolutely right, conspiracy theory demeans whatever argument there might be, and there are legitimate concerns that should be answered. So I think you're right. Let's look at those conspiracy theories and let's rebrand them, if you like, and say, look, if they're genuine concerns, then we should look at it. And I think any question that is unanswered by the relevant experts is something we should look at.
What do you obviously, I raise openly the notion of revolution, and people will say, have all sorts of connotations that they attach to that word. But by it, what I mean is that we need something new. Do you agree, or do you think we can reform what we have had?
I think we need to get trust back with everybody. We need to have sensible discussions. At the moment, what's happening, and people are sort of working in a vacuum where they confirm their own prejudices, and people are being alienated on both sides. What we need is sensible discussions where you get the experts in who set out the evidence, as you would do in a court of law, and give us those facts. I'm not a doctor. I don't know the right prescription, the right medication, the right treatment for people. What I do know is that people who are suffered as a result are not getting the answers they deserve.
What you do know is what you want to know.
Yes.
And you are entitled to have answers to the questions.
We're all entitled to answers,
that you are.
And we're entitled to question everything.
We're on a break already, after which, well, questions about the use of Midazolam. I'll be joined by Andrew Bridgen, MP for Reclaim UK, and by a lady who believes her father died after being administered the drug. We'll talk as well at the same time, for balance, to a GP, and we'll all be in search of answers. I'll be back in a moment.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Monday to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Neil Oliver Live. Now, have you heard of the drug Midazolam? Midazolam was and is used as part of what is called end-of-life care. Precisely how and why it was prescribed during the past 3 years has preoccupied the minds of many people. Those whose loved ones were given Midazolam, in care homes especially, want to know more about how and why the decision was taken to prescribe that drug. Joining me now to air the topic is Reclaim UK MP Andrew Bridgen and also Emma, who questions the part played by Midazolam in her dad's death. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Andrew, if I can come to you first of all, what is it that you are being asked about Midazolam and by whom?
Well, I have concerns, Neil. I'm one of the MPs who voted in 2014 to get rid of the Liverpool care pathway as being harmful and unsuitable. And in April 2020, Matt Hancock and the NHS authorised NG, NICE Guideline 163, which since then, relatives who've lost their parents and loved ones have come to me and said they believe those guidelines, the prescription of midazolam and morphine, a respiratory suppressant, to people who were already suffering depressed respiration, that it accelerated or caused their death. I held an event in June where 70 bereaved relatives came, and a lot of them had a chance to give very harrowing accounts of their experiences of their relatives' end of life in hospital. And the government don't seem to want to talk about it. I wrote to the government reasonably, I thought, some reasonable questions. One of them was how many elderly, vulnerable people were moved out of hospital into care homes to make way for the expected first wave of COVID patients in early 2020, and how many of those had sadly died within 7 days, 14 days, 28 days, 56 days, etc., of A, COVID-19, B, other causes. And the government wrote back and said they don't hold that data. So they're telling me they have no idea who they moved out of hospital and what happened to them.
Which seems extraordinary.
Very extraordinary. And Emma's here to tell her story about her father. And unfortunately, Neil, I've heard far too many of these stories over the last 12 months.
Emma, if I can come to you, what is the story that you would like to be more widely known about your dad?
Well, first of all, Neil, I'd like to thank you so much for taking this opportunity to have me on. I'm here representing all the people who haven't had a voice so far, and this is the story about my dad. I've written it in note form because it's obviously a very emotional subject for me. He was an extremely fit 83-year-old, 84 when he died. He loved walking. He lived for life. He did sport his entire life. The year beforehand, we went to the Lake District and we climbed Scarfell, which took us 7 hours. That Christmas time, 2019, he outdanced everybody at the community centre. Everybody was just loving it. He just had such a fantastic afternoon. When it came to looking for a care home in the January, it was really important to us that we sourced a home that could cater for his activities so that he could remain in his walking groups, and they assured us that he could. He wanted to remain active and keep on about his daily routines. During his time there, which was 10 months, he inexplicably deteriorated. By the 2nd of December 2020, I went to see him and I was absolutely heartbroken and shocked. I'd seen him 3 times that year, and this time, this man who'd been walking, could outwalk anybody, he was wheeled out in a wheelchair. He was absolutely slumped down with his head just fallen. And he was wheeled towards me and I was sat there and he lifted his head up, which was really difficult, and he saw me, tried to lift his arms, and the assistant manager said, "No, Jack, sit down. You know you're not allowed to hug anybody," and wheeled him straight past me. And I was in absolute devastation at that point. And this to me was, it took about 10 months for this to happen. And to me, he looked heavily sedated. And I made it clear the next day when I rang up, I made a complaint. And I said, "What have you done to him? He looks heavily sedated." I was expecting a call back, but I didn't get a call back from anybody until his main carer actually gave me a call, and I wasn't expecting her. And I got on really well with this particular lady, and I really felt that she was trying to tell me something, because out of the blue she said, "Emma, I really hate to say this, but your dad's very, very ill and he needs to be in hospital, and I'm going to be really honest with you, I don't think he's going to make Christmas." Now, this was the 4th of December, and I didn't know how to take that bit of news. I mean, it's not the sort of thing that you take lightly, and I don't think it's the sort of thing that she would have said lightly over the telephone if she didn't knew it to be true. She also said it's been a pleasure looking after him and that she'll miss him. He got transferred to a hospital the following day, on the 5th of December, but this wasn't even the hospital that he's used to be going to. It was a completely different hospital, 27 miles away. And the pathway that I'm going to tell you about a little bit later, this is where that pathway was created. The following week, they wouldn't let me in at all. Despite all my efforts, I kept getting told, no, he's not end of life, he's not dying. But I kept thinking that his carer wouldn't have just said that, you know? They wouldn't let me come in, and then they kept using this word agitated. He's in for agitation. And I'm like, why do you get sent to hospital with agitation? It just didn't make sense. And they stuck to it over and over. Finally, after about a week of trying to get into with my dad, I spoke to a sympathetic nurse on, by now, this was the 11th of December, who agreed that I could finally come in and see my dad. He said, I think it will be good for you, and I think it will be good for him. I was absolutely shocked when I saw him, even worse than before.
At what point do you think Midazolam was playing a part in what was happening with your dad?
I didn't know at that point anything. His speech had completely gone. His mouth was covered in blood, his jaw was just rolling around. He had bumps and scratches all over the place where he'd had lots of falls, and that's specific with a lot of those types of medications because they affect your central nervous system. So he'd had a lot of falls, so he had bumps and scratches, a bit of a broken nose, black eyes. He was in a terrible state, and also 10 kilograms lighter as well. And that would have had a huge effect on the medications that they gave him in the next couple of days.
Can I just pause you there while I bring in the doctor? You know, because I think it's appropriate that we bring in Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, GP. You know, you're listening to this, Dr. Kendrick. Can I just segue, bring in your contribution at this point? How were elderly people in care homes being treated? You know, were GPs readily admitted during the time of lockdown to see patients face to face?
Well, a lot of doctors didn't go in to see people face to face. I worked in a number of care homes and also in working with the elderly, and saw approximately 36 of people that I was involved in did die of what was probably COVID. But yes, quite often, and during this situation, a lot of people were prescribed things without necessarily being seen by the GP. So that would be the case, yeah.
So it wasn't necessarily the case that, as one might expect in the case of the care of a loved one, that a GP was intrinsic to that process, that treatment was being administered by people who weren't general practitioners.
Well, it would normally. Well, saying they didn't go in, they would have been communicated with, sometimes over Zoom calls or whatever. So there would have been a decision made by a doctor somewhere that the patient was approaching end of life, and that therefore, if they could put them onto what are called the end of life medications, that would be a medical decision. Sorry,
it must surely take a great deal of wisdom, you know, to be looking at an elderly patient who let's say has a respiratory ailment that's making it hard for that person to breathe. How would a decision be made about whether or not to treat that person and keep them alive, or, on the contrary, to prescribe a combination of drugs, including midazolam, which suppress breathing?
Yeah, well, I mean, these are difficult decisions. They are very tricky things, obviously, because you are at a stage where you're saying to relatives that we believe that, you know, your loved one is actually getting worse, is not going to recover, and therefore we need to try and make them as comfortable as possible. It wouldn't necessarily be put on midazolam. It would be what they call a drug. If someone did become agitated, terribly agitated, they would be given midazolam. That was the case before COVID. It's still the case. I mean, I still see elderly people who reach a point where you think this person is at, if you like, within days of probably dying, and we withdraw kind of the standard treatments. But the midazolam is widely, it's still widely used. I mean, but it's always used. I mean, if someone was being given it months and months before their death, that, obviously I can't comment because I don't know the case, but you would be thinking that is probably premature if that was happening. And as Andrew Bridgen said, well, the end of life, the Liverpool care pathway was got rid of, but the end of life pathway, which I don't like calling it a pathway because it does sound a bit like you're on a path and it's a conveyor belt, and it's almost some people did see it that way, unfortunately. The basic treatments that are given, if appropriate, are really just to try and make people as comfortable as possible.
Doctor, I have to just get to a break at the moment, after which we'll all be staying here for more of this discussion about midazolam. So bear with me, coming back in a couple of minutes.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, good evening. I'm Jonathan Vaughtry, here with your latest GB News weather forecast provided by the Met Office. There's increasing threats of some heavy and thundery showers as we move into the second half of the weekend. For Saturday evening, though, generally lighter showers on the cards for southwest England, Wales, generally pushing towards Northern Ireland into the early hours of Sunday morning. The cloud building across the southern two-thirds of the UK, so it will be a relatively mild night here, particularly across the far south of England, high teens holding up, but across the far north of Scotland, a much chillier night, 2 to 5 degrees Celsius quite widely, if not some frost in rural spots. That cloud and rain will continue to steadily progress its way northwards. The Northern Isles, parts of the Highlands are seeing a good amount of sunshine, but we'll start to see those heavy thundery showers pushing into southern England, Wales as we head throughout the day. Some local disruption and flooding is possible. Generally, temperatures will be a notch down compared to Saturday for the southeast, thanks to an increased amounts of cloud, but maybe slightly higher for parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland. Into Monday, this cold front will be swinging its way through. Behind that, we'll see some fresher air filtering in behind it. So still quite muggy and mild ahead of it, but eventually seeing those fresher conditions swing in. But on the cold front itself, again, really quite unsettled with heavy showers, thunderstorms and rain in the mixture, and quite a blustery day for all of us on the whole. There's further unsettled weather as we head throughout the rest of the week as well, and low pressure looks like it will be staying in charge. So enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye-bye.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton, for 2 hours packed full of unfiltered opinions, unique takes, and fiery debates. I guarantee you blockbuster guests and exclusive reporting with no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I think there is a culture of collusion, quite frankly.
And no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio, and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB Newsers, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard.
We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think. Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in their home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. We've been talking about Midazolam and how it was used in care homes during the time of lockdown. Andrew Bridget, if I can come back to you, what is the key point that you feel needs to be made about this subject at this time?
Well, following concerns raised to me by my constituents and others, I've done some digging on this, and I spoke to Professor Sam Ahmedzai, who he worked on the replacement for the Liverpool care pathway. It was NICE Guideline 31, and he is now retired, but he raised his concerns as a top palliative care expert about NG 163, which was brought in at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, that it was dangerous. NG 163, I've sent you a copy of it. It says, you know, do not be worried if of this use of midazolam and morphine being a respiratory suppressant, even if the patient is already respiratory suppressed. Now, we know from minutes in Hansard of the Health Select Committee meeting in early 2020 that Matt Hancock had already ordered all the midazolam. If it was only being used in normal usage for agitation, you would have had to order a large amount of the antidote, which has to be available, which can completely reverse the effect of midazolam, flamazanil. There was no orders for that. This was for end of life. NG 163 was replaced by, it was only 24 pages, it was replaced by NICE Guideline 191 in March 2021, which is about 350 pages, and midazolam is hidden in the detail. There's a lot of questions to be asked about how, and this is still going on today, Neil, and I think anybody who's watching this programme has concerns about what happened to their relatives in care homes or in hospitals during the pandemic. They need to raise these issues with their members of Parliament, and we need to discuss this openly. There are too many topics at the moment we can't discuss in the Motherwell Parliament.
It's got to be right to ask those questions, as we said at the top of the show. Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, he talked about end of life and so on and so forth, and basically easing that sort of side. To what extent were you consulted and kept informed that that was the pathway?
I wasn't informed at all. I kept getting told that he was agitated. This went on. So he went in on the 5th. By the 14th, I was told to come back in because your dad is dying now. After being told that he was agitated, he was brought in for agitation, to suddenly he was dying. When I turned up, he was in a side room. He was breathing so heavily, and I had to listen to that for 11, 12 hours. I'm later told that that's actually called air hunger, and it was him literally struggling to breathe because of the midazolam that he'd been given. When I'd obtained all the hospital records from the care home, the GP and the hospital, it turns out that on the 4th of December that he was admitted, the GP had actually prescribed 2.5 mgs of midazolam, syringe drivers, and I wasn't told at all. On the 9th, they started administering to him, and that went on till to the 14th, and that's when he went into a coma, and he started choking at about 5 o'clock in the morning, and I pulled the emergency alarm quickly because he'd been breathing so badly. The nurse runs in, runs straight out again, comes back in with a needle, injects him, didn't explain anything, and he died shortly after that. Turns out from the medical records, it was midazolam and alfentanil. The last injection was alfentanil, so that's midazolam plus opioid.
Bear in mind, Neil, midazolam is the drug that they use on death row to humanely kill.
To sedate people before...
But he was agitated.
No, it's the lethal injection in America.
Dr. Kendrick, you listening to that, it's impossible to listen to that without feeling emotion. Are are people right to be concerned and to be asking questions individually and collectively about the way in which the elderly were treated in care homes during the pandemic?
Well, I absolutely completely believe. I mean, I have written and objected myself to the way that patients were sent out of hospital and into care homes who almost certainly did have COVID, and I was very vocal about this. And I think there were not enough staff in a lot of the care homes. They weren't properly supported. There was much that went on during this time that I do think we should be asking questions about, absolutely. And I'm certain that there will be individual cases, obviously they have to be looked into, where people were not treated as well as they could be. I mean, it's always difficult to say this because you sound like you're saying your colleagues didn't treat people properly, but the situation was very difficult. Midazolam, when I say use it myself, I don't really tend to use it myself, but it's one of the drugs for the end of life. It would normally be someone it would rarely be causing their breathing difficulty, although in some cases, obviously, it can and could. I think calling it a drug used in death row is kind of sort of ridiculous because, yes, if you prescribe too much of anything, you're going to kill somebody with.
But nonetheless, that is another context in which that particular product is used. Thank you, Dr. Kendrick. But Emma, you're the heart of the story here tonight. Obviously, where do you go from here? And what question do you continue to demand an answer for?
Well, after I'd found out that he'd been on midazolam and alfentanil, and that was the last things that he had that killed him, and I saw him suffer, rapidly trying to breathe and choking, it was horrendous. The next document that I found was this, and this is called The Use of Appropriate Chemical Restraint in the Management of Agitated Patients on General Wards and in Accident and Emergency. Within this document, it turns out, and this is my father's, this was made for my father, made in 2017, renewal 2020, November, 3 years before his death day, and he was put on what's called a rapid tranquilization pathway. Can you hear how horrendous that sounds? Rapid tranquilization. Now, when I equate that to what happened during lockdown and how quickly he deteriorated, that makes total sense to me. But we didn't even know about his kidney situation until a year later than 2017. Why was my dad put on this pathway? And this pathway is literally the same as NG 163 and the abolished Liverpool Care pathway.
Emma, the question that you ask has to be left hanging in the air. I don't think any of us are able to answer it, but thank you so much for coming forward with this. Andrew, again, thank you for airing this important topic, and Andrew as well. I'm sorry I haven't been able to come with you, but we'll be back in a moment for the final story of the night.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
delicious?
mental?
Put your mouth. OK, here comes a train. Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. every Sunday from 11. Join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything, I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. It's been a very emotional conversation that we've been having here about Midazolam. Andrew's still with me. Andrew, what do you make of that testimony?
Well, I thought Dr. Kendrick was very measured. I was expecting a big fight between Andrew and Dr. Kendrick. There wasn't. Begs all sorts of questions. And what I love about, say, as you started the show, we sort of turned around and said, look, I don't understand what the procedure is at the moment. We talk about end of life. And basically, doctors are there to do no harm. But we need to know what the procedure is. What I found shocking, and genuinely shocking, is that Emma sat there and I said, to what extent did you know what was going on, or were you asked to give consent? And she said she wasn't told at all. And all that happened is she went to see her relatives, slumped over, and it was going on for a very long period of time. That lack of communication has obviously created all sorts of issues along the lines. And what I love about this show is we try to shine more light and less heat on the topics. But to do that, we need to continue the discussion. Let's make sure we have further conversations with Dr. Kendrick, because I thought he was very amenable to say, let's listen to this. He admitted not everything had been done perfectly.
Yes.
And let's work out what those problems are. Part of the problem is communication.
Yes.
We need to know in what circumstances this was prescribed and what happens as a result.
What I find very frustrating, and I felt that Andrew Bridgen articulated the same frustration that I feel, that he's obviously being spoken to by many people who have simply got concerns, to put it mildly, and that there has been an abiding atmosphere in which, don't talk about certain things, including the use and potentially the misuse of Midazolam. But it's a subject that has to be aired.
Absolutely.
And there's Emma sitting there, one amongst, I don't know how many. Andrew talked about 70 people that came to an event. That needs to be put out into the sunlight where people can discuss it.
Without a doubt. And we always talk, we get numbed by statistics, but when you personify tragedy, that's when people sit up and take notice. And I think being brave and talking about her own personal journey and this tragic circumstance when she lost her own father brings it all to light. And I think those questions, what we need to do is continue examining that. And the trouble is when you start clouding it in emotive words, I mean, Andrew has brought in all sorts of comparisons in the past which got him into trouble. I think the reality is we need to ask the questions without that emotive language. If we can shine the light and say, look, this is very logical, help us make informed decisions, but tell us these procedures, then we're going to be able to make informed decisions accordingly.
And it's perhaps one of the most emotive subjects for people, and one of the most desperate experiences for so many people, that their loved ones in the most vulnerable of circumstances were out of their reach.
Yeah.
Emma and others found themselves in situations where they knew that their loved ones were struggling and weren't able to be with them. Yeah. And that's a story that repeated and repeated and repeated, with or without the presence and it
emphasises the grief and accentuates that as well. And in all due respect to the medical professionals, I'm sure that they want to do their best and trying to work out what is the way that they can do that. But we need to get clarity on both sides. There needs to be much better communication to make that make sense.
Yes. Where do you think we need to go now as a community?
I think we need to have rational discussions in the way that we have. Let's not the war, jaw, not war. And people just accusing each other doesn't really help. What we need to do is make sure we improve communications on that sort of premise.
I find it a huge relief. You know, I feel that word Midazolam is out there, and I feel a great relief in it having been spoken tonight. But once again, Andrew, we have run out of time. That is it from me this evening. Thanks, obviously, to my guests, Andrew Bridgen, MP for Reclaim UK, to Emma, who spoke so emotively and so movingly about her dad, to Dr Malcolm Kendrick, and, of course, to Andrew Eborn for that insightful consideration. Next up, it's the Common Sense Crusade, and I will see you next Saturday.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers. Proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, good evening. I'm Jonathan Vaughtry, here with your latest GB News weather forecast provided by the Met Office. There's increasing threats of some heavy and thundery showers as we move into the second half of the weekend. For Saturday evening, though, generally lighter showers on the cards for southwest England, Wales, generally pushing towards Northern Ireland into the early hours of Sunday morning. The cloud building across the southern two-thirds of the UK, so it will be a relatively mild night here, particularly across the far south of England, high teens holding up, but across the far north of Scotland, a much chillier night, 2 to 5 degrees Celsius quite widely, if not some frost in rural spots. That cloud and rain will continue to steadily progress its way northwards. The northern Isles, parts of the Highlands, seeing a good amount of sunshine, but we'll start to see those heavy thundery showers pushing into southern England, Wales as we head throughout the day. Some local disruption and flooding is possible. Generally, temperatures will be a notch down compared to Saturday for the southeast, thanks to an increased amounts of cloud, but maybe slightly higher for parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland. Into Monday, this cold front will be swinging its way through. Behind that, we'll see some fresher air filtering in behind it, so still quite muggy and mild ahead of it.